So my first question, and Stan, this is going to be for you because we'll start with looking at, in your experience, what is the purpose of a community of practice?
I think the primary purpose is for people who share an interest or a specialty or a role to come together to learn from one another. In the process of doing that, there are lots of types of interactions that they may have, asking and answering questions, sharing information with one another, helping each other out with problems, helping to locate resources. Could go on and on, but at the core, people join communities because they want to. They have an identification with the subject of the community, and they want to further their knowledge in that subject. So if the community is successful, they'll continue to participate in it, continue to deepen their expertise. And if it's not, then they'll not paying attention to it and do something else. So primarily there to learn, but also to interact with the members and learn together.
And picking up on that point you mentioned in terms of experts, maybe, and Kim, you might also have a view in this space in terms of the expert and the capability shape. Do you think communities of practice, Kim, need to have that as a formality piece, as an almost strict purpose? Would that help?
I think it depends on the type of organisation or structure that the community of practice operates within. Where I work at Oricon, we have formal communities of practice, or capabilities as they're known as, and they are kind of the backbone to the organisation. But then, in other types of organisations, they may be a little bit more informal, and sometimes the experts just rise to the top because of the nature of a particular community and its purpose. So I think it just is dependent on the context in which they are established and run.
Thank you. Rachel, you spoke of quite a few of those big organizations that you've worked with. Is that what Kim said? Does that resonate from the formal, informal piece from your experience with working with them?
So I've kind of seen the gamut, which is highly structured, highly organized, top down. I don't actually recommend that because I usually get brought in for some version of we're having engagement issues. And that's one of the worst ones to fix because everybody's been told to do it. And so some structure is great because it allows the communities to be efficient, but too much structure or not any structure leaves either a lot to chance or just leaves people like uninterested because it didn't come from something they were inherently interested in.
And Stan, I noticed a lot of head nodding in there and agreeing. Would that be one of the areas where we look at why a community would be successful, or where another one would maybe slip off into redundancy? Does it need to be a balance in these two areas of structured, unstructured?
Well, I agree with Rachel that not one extreme or the other, but it doesn't have to be very, very structured. The main thing is you need to start with a topic that's compelling, that people identify with and want to join. So where communities often go wrong is right there. They don't get the topic right. They choose an esoteric topic. They choose some topic that uses an organizational terminology that is not widely identified with. So that's the number one thing, is pick the topic right. And secondly, you have to achieve a critical mass of membership. If your topic is too narrow and there's not enough people to join it, it'll never take off. So you have to find one that's not too broad and not too narrow, in which the people will be attracted to join. In the process of doing that, you'd like the community to be unique, because if you have a bunch of redundant communities, then none of them can achieve critical mass. So it's better if there's one community for a topic rather than a bunch. And then you need to have a leader that's committed to the success of the community. If you do the structured top-down thing that Rachel referred to, or somebody's assigned to lead it, that's not going to usually work. You want the leader to be somebody who's passionate about it and wants to spend, in some cases, their free time leading that community because they believe in it. And if that's true, and the other two things are true, they're likely the community will succeed.
You mentioned that it's good to have enough people in them. Do you have a rough idea of what a sort of size? I mean, it obviously will depend on the purpose and organization or outside organization, but is there a sort of number that would really then help a community thrive?
Yeah, I think there is, and it's based on the rule of thumb of 90% of a community generally will not post in a community. And I've seen some people posting in the chat about lurking, and lurking sometimes takes on a negative connotation, but there's nothing wrong with lurking. 90% of community will lurk. And as long as they pay attention and learn, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's a good thing. But if you have too small a community, then 10% of a small number is too few a number of people. So I generally use the term 100 as a minimum number because 10% of that is 10. So if you have 10 different people posting, it's probably enough to sustain it. We actually did some research on this when I was at Deloitte using our Yammer community to see what the actual numbers were. And it turned out that in our case, 200 was a better number. We had a Yammer group of 200, then it's tended to take off and have activity that's sustained. And if it was below that, it tended to taper off and become inactive.
Yeah. That's really interesting insight. And I think that takes nicely to Andrew, some of the things you've talked about the people element and the collaboration. I wanted to investigate one area with you about community practice because they can often, and Kim mentioned this, be quite deep and specific and have that purpose, which is really relevant. How can the people in that community also be a bridge to others? So be just outside that silo a little bit and to be able to connect.
Yeah, and that's a key issue because when you've got a very strong focus on expertise, we can sometimes be a little bit narrow. And I think a big part of a community is bringing in sort of outside knowledge from other sources that maybe even lie outside of the organization as well, and using it as a bridge to areas of interest that you adopt, in maybe you have an extracurricular life outside of work that has some crossover, or from events, or just bringing in some other perspectives, because I think we sometimes look at the community being just a knowledge marketplace where it's just, well, I have a problem, here's my answer. But actually, there's much more to it where we can bring in different perspectives, sorry, and actually shape knowledge and
Yes.
improve it as it flows through the community. So absolutely. And I think there's just a case of setting expectations that we're not looking just to have questions and answers, but we want to know what else is going on. What else are you seeing? What are you learning? What are you seeing outside of the organization that's maybe sparked some interest, and bringing, whether it's trends or ideas or expertise you've come across elsewhere, and empowering people that this is what we actually want. And back to the point earlier around having somebody leading this and making sure that they set the expectations very clearly that we want this, we don't want just to focus on one or fewer areas.
I think that's a really interesting point in terms of the focus, and it speaks, I think, maybe to your role, Kim, in terms of the capability driving. Certainly, I have some experience with communities practice having that as a remit with the organization. What's your experience in terms of, say, utilizing a community practice to drive a capability forwards?
At the organisation that I'm currently at, we do an expression of interest to seek out interested people to be the leader of a capability, and then they're kind of appointed, so they want to be doing it. And then it's really on that leader to then galvanise the community and to get things happening. But there's very much an alignment with the direction of the business as well. So the capabilities are kind of segregated or constructed around our focus areas and where we're moving as a business. So they're kind of a mechanism outside of, I guess, project land to be learning, sharing and connecting. And then the types of people in those communities are moving the communities forward because there's a shared vision, passion and commitment to develop capability. So that's kind of the structure that we operate within.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I wanted to move slightly sideways in the conversation and into your space a little bit, Andrew and Rachel, in terms of the world that we sit in now, and there's a number of ways you can describe it. So VUCA, like the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and Kim shared with me earlier in the week, BANI, brittle, anxious, non-linear, incomprehensible. In that sort of space, are communities practice now more important than ever? Is that something that we should be talking about, whether it be for ourselves as people or people in organizations and the cultural aspect of what a community means. I'm really interested, maybe Rachel, if you want to jump in first, really interested in your thoughts in this space.
So I think they are more important than ever. I think that anxiety, however, makes them harder than ever. I think they've been on the internal side. COVID and the turbulence of the last few years has really shattered a lot of investment in community programs versus other types of collaboration, leadership, etc. And it's because it's not very well understood about how long it takes to get somewhere, the opportunities to integrate it into the flow of work if you have a digital piece of that community. So it can be an escalation point to your work teams. People don't collaborate in text very well. I was just having this chat with, I saw somebody mention this recently, and they haven't learned to, and they need to feel safe doing it. And as pressure has been exerted on businesses, everything's become very financially quantified, and it has to have immediate ROI. And so some of these kind of slower burn value propositions have been really hard for organizations to invest in recently. And I will add, all of the anxiety is making it hard to find people who have the emotional energy to champion that new thing in an organization. So like, who's the one that wants to step up and kind of keep beating their head against a brick wall? So they face a lot of challenges in organizations right now. I think they're part of the solution, but Microsoft has eaten the world, and Microsoft doesn't really help companies understand the difference between teams and communities. And it has to do with the architecture and accessibility and like, I could go on and on, but there are a lot of problems right now in this space because of all of that.
Thank you. Before we go to the Microsoft world eating, which I do want to get to, because I think it's an important conversation. Andrew, I'd want to bring your view in terms of the importance of the people connection side, and how do we help ourselves and potentially help our organizations understand the value of the connectivity piece the communities are integral and critical to.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'll briefly mention the Microsoft problem, which is a big piece of this, in that we have these tools that are actually perfect for communities. However, they're positioned largely at communications and adopted that way. And I've done some work with a government client where people were totally uncertain as to how to use Viva Engage, because it was rolled out as this connection tool, a space for everyone to share and interact very informally. And then it very quickly became an internal communications tool. And suddenly the language became very formal, very explicit around news, communications, leadership updates, things like that, very dry subjects that just put people off. No one was then going in there and sharing more ad hoc knowledge or stories. And we really needed to have a rethink about the perception of Viva Engage and what was needed to make it a safer space for this genuine peer-to-peer connection, rather than just one to everybody communication. And it was just nothing had changed in terms of how people were allowed to use the platform. It was just their perceptions based on the language of communication. And so there's a big onus on how we actually position it and the language we use, but also that perhaps we need to separate communication from communities and make it very explicit and very clear that these are spaces for connection, for networking, and we mentioned before the topics, having very clear topics, areas of shared need. Otherwise, people don't respond to a communication style, and we really miss that opportunity to build relationships, which I think is really at the heart of communities, particularly when we're not in the same place at the same time so much.
Exactly. And the last point you just mentioned, I wanted to pick up, Stan, obviously you run a global community now. having retired, but also Deloitte with a global company. What do you see I suppose the challenge of these digital spaces that are evolving probably in the communication space faster than most of us have been used to? And how do communities like yours or organizational communities manage that global local piece? Because you want to have the global benefit of expertise and of people and of reach, and we can get that now. But you also want to have and maybe trust your local community from a cultural and psychological safety perspective. I just wondered, do you see that as an opportunity that communities should take to try and work with the organization in that?
Yes, there's always an interesting challenge to handle that. So if you're in a global company and you're trying to have a global community, there's always going to be people that want to form their local community. And if you're not clear on what the role of the local community and what the role of the global one is, you can get into a situation where people are cut off from what would be the helpful global community where they might learn more or get their questions answered because they're only talking amongst a small number of people in, say, in a specific country. So what I've always tried to do is position that as global community for the purposes of online discussions and global webinars, and have the local chapters be subsets of that rather than independent communities, and they would meet locally in person and they would advance their local causes and maybe even have local language discussions. But realize that for the general sharing of knowledge and for when they have a question, they should come to the global online discussion. And if you make it real clear that it's not trying to limit local communities, but position them to fit into the global, then they can coexist. And a good example of that is with SIKM. There are some local chapters. So in the case of Boston, for example, where Rachel is, there's a Boston local chapter of SIKM, and they meet in person regularly and they do a lot of good things, but they don't try to replicate the online discussions that we have in SIKM.
Kim, from your experience picking up on the global leadership piece, because you spoke about an EOI about to put leaders in, do they have that remit to try and pull people together?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a business side to our capabilities, but there's also a cultural piece and a development and making people feel connected as part of something else is kind of the purpose of our capability. So absolutely the capability leader, if they can't lead, and it doesn't mean lead with, we will do this, it's almost encouraging a movement, is that the type of person that we're interested in having our capability leaders, but also has the influencing skills, because these are lead by influence, not by authority roles that we have. And so we really need them to work their magic on the capability, but also to bring others up as well,
Yes.
and not just be the figurehead. We have a community that runs a community. They just happen to have the named role.
Yeah. Do you have more than one named role? Maybe driving particular things forwards within that, or are you at the point in which there's a leader? I mean, do you need managers? Do you need community moderators? Is that something that happens?
We just have the leader as the named role, but then each capability might have a series of kind of special interest groups. So a lot of them run what we call knowledge and learning councils, and they will have a little cohort in that will kind of work with my team around, getting all their knowledge in ship shape for sharing and tips and tricks. Others might have a kind of a technical engineering, kind of small working group. So it just depends on the nature of the group, and it also largely depends on the personality of the leader as well.
Rachel?
I just wanted to chime in because I spent a couple of years working with Microsoft hardware, not Microsoft software, on a community of practice network for their 40,000 people in 5 business groups. So they were digitized. They didn't have digital communities of practice. They had in-person communities of practice in Redmond. We were digitizing that. And we actually had 8 stakeholder groups, from the GMs of each of the business all the way down to sponsors of the community and then leaders of the community. But then we had digital engagement leaders too, because some of the expertise-oriented leaders who had the credibility and organizational leadership didn't exactly know how to engage online. And so we found it very helpful. And then we had objectives for the higher levels of stakeholders to actually validate and elevate the work that was being done in the communities. And so those leadership roles were getting kind of visibility within the organization, which helped motivate them to kind of commit to that. But like it was a pretty complicated thing to roll out. It wasn't give somebody a role and let them run with it. It was a lot of like, let's talk about this and let's get all the pieces in place so that people are motivated to engage.
Yeah, I'd like to explore that a little bit further, because I think one of the challenges to organizations who maybe have communities of practice, but maybe they haven't gone as far or engaged as many people as they want, or someone who wants to start them up because they've heard that they're a good thing, engagement is really the critical thing to then be able to build anything else on top. So let's have a little bit about engagement and the experience of what might be works or what doesn't, and obviously there will be the digital side that comes in. Maybe this is something, Andrew, you wanted to start with, and that we can explore that a little.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it like any adoption, whether it's technology or a work process, it's what's in it for me that drives engagement. And if there's not a formal financial incentive, which there usually isn't, then there's got to be a clear personal need, whether it's around positioning yourself with your personal brand, which is for some people a driver, but not for everybody. For some people, they are genuinely wanting to help. Others, they just want to listen, and it's, I guess, acknowledging that you can't change that. The safety of the space is a big key area. So feeling safe enough that you can interact in some way. So the language, the tone, having a community manager that has the right style of communication in there really helps. But also, it doesn't always have to be about the conversation. You can pull people in using other things like polls or other ways to interact, as long as there's that sense that they are engaged with the conversation. Trying to assume that everyone should speak up, I think, is maybe you're going to sort of let yourself down there. But understanding that there are different ways of engaging, and also for community managers and just influencers generally in the tools we use, listening is a big part of it as well. It's not just pushing out content, it's actually being there and responding to people to drive that conversation. To make sure that there's no post goes unanswered or no question goes unanswered, because that will also put off engagement. So there's a few levers we can pull, but it's also accepting that there are different personalities, different types will have different ways of engaging in a community.
Stan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I want to echo that one. Two important points. One about the no one answered questions is very important. And then the fact that engagement, for 90% of the community, engagement is to pay attention. So if they're paying attention, that's the key engagement. It's not that they have to post. They aren't going to. In fact, you wouldn't want everyone posting, right? If everyone was posting, it would be too much, and then people would get turned off by that. So 10% actually works out pretty well as long as you have the critical mass. But you want the 90% to be listening, learning, reading. And if that's happening and the other 10% are posting, then I'd say the community's doing well. So you want to make sure that the questions get answered. You want to make sure that you have things other than just online discussions. In the case of SICAM, we have monthly calls where we can hear one another. So I think that supplements it well. But even there, we don't get a huge number attending those calls. So you're never going to get 100% of your community engaging with anything, but you're trying to get them to at least pay attention and benefit from what's being discussed.
I actually have a little bit of a different perspective because I've done a lot of research, and you can get much higher engagement from community practice, but it's back to Andrew's point, which is it depends on what's in it for me. And it depends. What I found after working with communities, you have to have a strong shared purpose, but you have to actually have strong shared value that keeps being generated. Meaning, if I can do something easier in the community than I can do without it, then I will keep coming back. Something I want to do, meaning like something that helps me do something better. And it really depends. Like it depends on what the purpose of the community is. Is it like front end innovation expertise, or is it relatively general expertise? And so there's a lot of factors that change that, and that gets rolled into the what's in it for me, and the safety and how well it's managed, and the organization around it. If the organization around it is toxic, it's going to be really hard to get any community of practice really trusting each other. Yeah.
I think it was interesting that you mentioned the different purposes of communities of practice, because I suppose we think about them quite often as a group of people who effectively do the same thing and are just sharing something maybe in a different way. But you brought a good point to light. And so as Kim talking about the capabilities, is you might have a community that is forward thinking and doing research or trend analysis that is then coming back and supporting that community. And maybe this is for any of you, in terms of those purposes, what range have you seen? Maybe I'll jump to you, Andrew, first.
I've just got a great one that's like a kind of a counter-intuitive community, but it was one central government department that wanted a community of dissatisfaction. They wanted to surface all the negative sentiment, all the dislike of how things work, because they were very worried that everything was going outside of the organization, that people were putting these thoughts out in Glassdoor and other areas, and a lot of unresolved issues. So they really wanted to create a community that could capture this and, in theory, deal with it. I mean, I don't know where that went in the end, because for the community manager, it's very, very hard to manage that kind of a community. But it's an example. It doesn't have to be about we're fixing something, or we're sharing expertise, or we want to surface pictures of our cats. There's a whole range of things from the positive to the negative, and it's understanding, well, what's the need, and taking a step back. What is it that's really a critical issue for this organization? And if it is, there's a big negative sentiment going on around something, well, then we need to talk about it. We can't just kind of brush it under the carpet.
That's a really interesting example. Are there others?
Yeah, I've seen a number appear or emerge and then kind of dissolve over time because they've been set up around kind of hot topics. And I mean, this one's not going to probably go away, and it'll probably become something more formal. But in our organization, when the whole AI piece kicked off with ChatGPT, a community of practice was set up almost straight away to just bring like-minded folks together. And that community's actually got legs now. But then I've worked in other organizations who there's just been something that's been emerging. It might only be around for a year, and then it dissolves and it kind of reaches its natural end. But that group of people are still connected because they've used the vehicle of a community of practice to meet each other. So I think they just kind of can come and go as well. It doesn't always need to be kind of set in stone forever.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think if we'll probably wrap up in 5 or so minutes, because we've got quite a lot of questions. But let's explore the Gen AI piece, not just from the community point, but how might the emerging tech or the new ways of thinking be impacting communities of practice? Is this a positive? Are there negative connotations to it? Where do you, as people, see the benefit perhaps of this, or like so? I mean, I'm sure Microsoft will come into this conversation at some point, for example. Do you want to kick this off, Rachel?
Yeah, I'm happy to, because I just answered a question in the chat about how can you capture all the valuable stuff in a community. Gen AI is great for summarizing things. So that's something that can absolutely be used to make sure there's summaries and point back to the live discussions, right? So you're not stripping them, but you're helping people find them. So one of the things I've found is people talk about the same thing in a lot of different ways. So communities are great because they're not communication saying this is the way we talk about this, but it's not the way half the population talks about it. Like people can find that information. So AI is great there, but generative AI can't learn without communities. So like we have all these conversations. One of the things associations are doing in the US is they're starting to create large language models for their industries, and they're planning on selling them, right? Because that is the expertise of their industry, right? And so they're great feeder data sets if you need to do research about that space for a project or whatever. Some companies may not want to do that, but between those two, there's value on the input side and there's value on the output side.
I'm happy to share an example as well, Esther. We've been using our communities of practice to help us with content verification and a bit of governance work. So, obviously we're going with the AI tools piece and generative AI, and using their subject matter expertise, because we're very keen to have the human in the loop, and we see that capabilities are a kind of a key stakeholder in this conversation. So that's been an interesting exercise, because there's been an upskilling and awareness raising piece needed. We've been dealing with some cynics, and then we've turned some cynics around because of the engagement of this. So we've also been teaching our communities of practice along the way as part of this as well.
I just add to Kim, I think Kim's points about these communities supporting the development of Gen AI are really, really key, because it's such an unknown area. I mean, our organization, I work with organizations that are rolling out Copilot, for example, and no one really knows if it's going to work and what the impact's going to be. So communities are a great way to test it, to find out what is working for some people, what are the risks, what are we surfacing that we shouldn't be surfacing, talking about the impact, because otherwise it can be really hard to really understand truly what the impact is for good or bad. On the flip side of it, it also is a great tool, like Rachel mentioned, like the capabilities can really help communities. And the fact that in, like, say in meetings, you can ask your Gen AI tool, is there anything I should have asked? Is there something that's been unanswered? Is there something that we need to follow up on? It's very, very good for helping a community manager to maybe bring something up that has been missed. So there's two sides, but I think we do still need to have the human side sort of supporting Gen AI and vice versa.
Yeah, I see that there's a lot of roles for potentially, it can help with tagging and classifying conversation threads. It can listen to recordings of our online calls and summarize them. It could help answer questions by pointing people back to previous threads that have already discussed that, so the moderator doesn't have to do that. So to me, there's a lot of great potential there.
I mean, truly great to have those examples from you, because I think sometimes organizations are now seeing Gen AI as a sort of magic tool to solve lots of things, and thinking, well, maybe it can replace some of this other investment or other work with communities, whereas actually the benefit of the overlay is so much greater than either one on their own. So there were some great examples. Thank you so much for sharing. We're going to jump to questions in a minute, but I'm going to challenge each of you in one sentence to say what you think the future of communities is going to be.
Well, I think the future communities will be similar to the situation with knowledge management in general, which is that there's a cyclical nature to it. As I think Rachel pointed out, there's these funding challenges that happen cyclically. The need is always going to be there. So we'd be better off if we always had them and we built on them and made them more successful. But the reality is that they'll come and go, and we'll have to keep reinstituting them. But the need will never go away. The benefit will always be there. But we can't rely on community programs always being sustained. We'll have to keep probably starting them up again.
I think in an increasingly digital AI world, human connection will become even more important. So I see communities of practice as a real opportunity with these into the future.
Couldn't agree more. But Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, what Kim said is absolutely so true. I mean, this is one of the biggest issues, is that sense of deeper connection beyond the team, and indeed, if you don't see the team in person, this is hard. I think also, I mean, communities we just need to keep talking to our people. We need to really understand what are the issues, what are the things that we need to surface, what should we build communities about. So I think there's this, rather than just ignoring some of the elephants in the room, we need to actually speak to our people and understand what do we need to talk about, and use communities as a vehicle for this, because work is complicated. Hybrid hasn't really settled down into anything in particular, and having these discussions is really, really key. And acknowledging that we need this, that technology alone isn't going to solve things. Communities has this really important role in that bridge between our people and the technology, and what we work and who we are as well. And that loss of bringing our full selves into work is another issue I think we're struggling with a bit, as we sort of try to get sort of more pigeonholed into expertise rather than who we actually are.
Thank you. And Rachel?
So I am working on a book called Control is for Amateurs, and it's about this premise that organizations are the governance model of organization is mechanistic. It's not human. It tries to standardize humans, actually. And my premise is that we need a community model side by side with the mechanistic governance model, because people thrive in communities. We don't thrive by doing the same thing again and again and again tomorrow. But that's what our governance really wants us to do. And there's a lot of friction in organizations between people and the technology and the governance. And it's because people are not standardized parts. We're never going to be standardized parts. That's not how we do our best work. And we're in this massive argument with ourselves about that right now. So I think communities are not going away, because that's what people crave. That's how people learn. That's how people thrive. So they will exist either implicitly or explicitly. You can ignore them or you cannot, but they're going to be there. Whether we choose to make them explicit and understand human value that's not production value, meaning AI technology will never energize people. It will never make diamonds worth anything, right? Like De Beers convinced people diamonds were meaningful and therefore valuable, right? So like things are valuable because they mean something interesting to people, and other people are the only ones that can do that for each other. And we keep trying to like turn this into a production machine. And it just doesn't work that way, and it never will. And the faster we get to, okay, we're not using people well, and we need to really invest in this model that optimizes people and gives them what they need to really excel, then we'll be off to the races.
Okay, thank you so much. We're going to jump to audience questions now, and Tracy, one of my colleagues helping organise this, is going to come in and help with that, because there are quite a few, which is awesome. Thank you, audience. Tracy, what's our first question?
Yes, so our first question from JP Stoffel, we may need to get you to jump online and kind of like call it out for us, but is, are there any benefits to driving a regular in-person digital meetup to break through some typed chat anxiety? Can activities go beyond formal training style formats? Are there any formats to help social interaction, such as community open forums, topic Q&A sessions? You're nodding nicely there, Andrew.
Well, so this is just, it's more of an opportunity, I think. So I've been doing some work around hybrid experience and what organizations are doing to try and help create a positive hybrid experience where perhaps we don't have agreement. And what is it that gets people into the office? What is it that helps people work from home? And it all comes down to connection with people. That's the role of the office. And I think there's just maybe there's an opportunity for a little bit more proactive thinking around how we can encourage people into the office where maybe it's not already mandated around such community activities, something that there is a need, there is that unmet purpose that people are craving, and we do that in the office, and we do it on a certain scheduled event. So there is this opportunity to come in voluntarily, hopefully, because that's, I think, is something that's lacking. No one's going to go into the office voluntarily just to sit in an empty room and stare at a screen. They are going to come in if there is some meaningful interaction with people. So it's not maybe explicitly community. You could have it around any other sort of function, but it's a way of sort of framing that. Well, how do we incentivize people to come in? What is it they're going to get out of that? Hopefully that answers the question partially. I know it's not. It's much of my take on it, but yeah.
Excellent. Well, I should also say, for the audience, everyone here, please reach out to people outside this and have the conversation with us, because we probably won't get through all of this because it's such an interesting topic. So let's go to the next question.
We've got from Nicole Williams, what would be one approach to separate communication from communities, which I think was called out earlier on in your conversation.
Kim, do you want to give that a go from the sort of more corporate-y side because that is where maybe we see this?
It's an interesting one to ask me, because in my team I have a communications and change manager as part of our knowledge team, which works really well for us. And that individual who's actually on the call today, Farah, she works with our capabilities to help them with their comms, but the comms is very much coming from the community of practice lens, not a internal comms. Here's all the things, one way to go and the fire hose. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. So she makes the comms engaging, but makes it about them. I think the two are. I don't think you can uncouple the two, because often comms is also about demonstrating value and impact and building reach and audience as well. So maybe another panel member would have an alternate view to me, but comms are super important for both aspects.
Well, we have talked about it. Do either of you want to jump in on that one a little bit?
I'll
offer all of you.
I can offer my perspective, which is when comms as a function owns a community network within an organization, it's too easy to become just a communication channel. And 95% of what people do at work is work, not like hang out and listen to what's going on like with corporate comms. And so like figuring out how to integrate that community program with the work life of the organization is important, no matter who owns the community platform, because I agree, you can't separate communications and community. But if you give a traditional comms team communities, they often think about it as just an email channel or a social media channel or whatever, and they've got a very just publish by direct. So like it really depends on the people and how things are organized, but it's a risk.
Absolutely, it's a huge risk, and I'd say the problem stems from quite often it's the same tool. So we're using the same tool for communications and communities. So if we are going to do that, then we need to be explicit in how we frame it, and that there is this separation between this is the community side of it, this is the communication side of it. They are different different practices, treat it as a different tool and have different rules around how to use it if you want it. I mean, ideally, you'd have communications that are fully open and interactive and you want people to respond and engage. But I know that some organizations don't want that. So if that's the case, be explicit and make sure that communities are treated differently. Otherwise, wouldn't it be great if communications was that informal style and we sort of have a community-based approach to it rather than the sort of the formality of a lot of communication. So that kind of depends on what you want and whether you want interaction with communications or whether you want it purely as a sort of top-down. And then if that's the case, maybe we don't use our community platforms for that and we use something else.
All right, well, let's jump on to the next question. I know Stan's waiting for a question. What's next, Tracy?
Identifying capability, or can you find capability leaders of a community of practice? How do you qualify them? And is there ever any conflict between, I guess, what the business considers, an expert versus someone that the community might consider an expert? Is there any way that people have actually, a checklist of qualifications, you must have done this to be able to become one?
Well, in my experience, you generally find that the experts emerge from the community as opposed to necessarily having to be pre-identified. It's a good idea to have respected people who are respected by the community, who are members and active and setting a good example. But I always say when it comes down to this question of expertise location, I say you don't need to have expertise location if you have good communities, because the experts will become apparent by their activity in the community, by answering questions, by sharing, and that becomes better than if someone gets anointed as an expert.
Well, let's jump to the next question then, because we're getting some good questions too. Thank you, everybody.
How can you boost engagement of a community of practice?
Short and sweet.
It was actually longer than that, but my chat keeps dropping, so apologies.
Perfect. No, that's perfect.
That was the crux of it. I think Ange has got several communities that she actually runs, but the members are only actively participating. There's only a small member actively participating and sharing. So how can you, any tips on how you can actually boost the engagement across all of them?
So I'll answer again. I know that Rachel and I had a slightly different view on it, but my view is that if your community is growing and adding members, and if those members are actually subscribed and reading the updates and so forth, then that's engagement that you want. And so I'd say it's not realistic to try to get everyone to be actively posting in a community. I don't think that's ever going to happen. So define engagement differently than that and say as long as the people are joining and they're attracting more members, and those members get value, and if you were to talk to them, they would say, yes, I get value out of the community, then that's to me would be a successful community. As long as a certain number of the people are actively posting and replying and speaking on calls and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. I think we have time for 2 more questions.
What do you guys think on leadership endorsement? Do you think it's a deterrent or it actually encourages communities?
Chime in with this one, please. Yeah, leaders. I mean, they make or break conversations, and I think the role of a leader is as much listening as it is pushing out what they say. So if you have a leader that's maybe involved in a community, but they're listening, they're replying, they're liking, they're involved in some way passively, I think that's incredibly empowering rather than one that's maybe taking over. If you have a leader that's too influential, that's maybe driving too much of the conversation, that can actually be a little bit off-putting. People maybe don't feel safe enough to respond, or it can diminish your own sort of empowerment to be open and honest. So yeah, how they interact, I think, is key. And yeah, listening is often the best policy.
But getting them to interact at all would be a plus.
Well, yes, absolutely. That's probably the most important thing.
I built scorecards because of this at one organization because leaders kept answering questions, and it shut down engagement because once your CEO or whoever answers the question, like, why would you say anything else? Because it's like the end of it. And so we gave the leaders of practices at this architectural firm a number of likes, responses, and posts for a quarter. And the post was like one post per quarter. And the likes was like 15 in a week. Every Friday, go in and like a bunch of stuff. And then, 5 or 10 comments that were more like, this is a really interesting conversation, I'm following it, or, something like that. So I absolutely agree with Andrew on that.
Going back to the leadership point just really quickly, Kim, because you talked about the type of person as a leader. Is that also an integral piece for this question?
I think so. It's, often the leader can role model the behavior, or they can encourage others to do it and then they follow in behind. So if a leader doesn't engage in, say, for example, a Viva Engage channel, I think that also then starts to say a lot about the community and the importance of the community, but they shouldn't be the one who's doing all of the posting and doing all of the replying and that sort of thing. So there is a balance, but if the leader is visibly disconnected, I think that's going to have, particularly in a formal community of practice, that's not going to end well for the outcomes of that particular community, in my experience.
Yeah. There's one quick follow-up question, I think, Tracy.
There was actually, and just following that, how do we actually, what's in it for me, for those leaders, to actually get them to contribute and engage in the posts to get others to be active in it as well?
For me, leaders are very isolated from what's going on in the organization a lot of the time. And particularly digital communities of practice are fabulous ways to help them understand not just the topics that are being discussed, but the tone and how active or not. It's management by walking around, right? Like just like checking out what people are commenting on. And it really takes some of those blinders off, because when somebody talks to them about a topic, they tend to hedge, massage, not say what they really think. If the leader is watching them discuss it amongst themselves, they'll learn a hell of a lot more about that. So there's a lot of value for leaders to have that going on that they can dip into when they have time to do it.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, we're almost right at the top of the hour. So there were some links in the chat that we put into for people's LinkedIn profiles. So please get in touch with everybody. Thank you so much to all of the speakers, for all of you coming on. Absolutely appreciated your expertise and your willingness to share. I'm just going to briefly pop in the details for the next session tomorrow, excitingly, same time, same place, basically, which is on capturing tacit knowledge. You should be able to see that on there, and the link's going to be in the chat. There are also 3 physical meetups, one in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, and you can register through Eventbrite, and our links are in the chat for those 3 as well. So please do sign up to that. Sydney needs a few more folk, please. I know we like to work from home, but on Thursdays, let's have a go at meeting up. And again, just say thank you so much to our presenters for their time, for the committee helping put this together, and then for everybody coming along and attending. We really appreciate your participation in our KM week. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.